Alrighty then. My name is Gina Hoang. I am a family medicine doctor. I'm also a computer geek, go by the cat. I do family medicine. One of the things I'm really interested in is reproductive health. And so, as you've noticed running around this con, there are a lot of very, very, very short hackers. It seems to be a plague, and I would imagine some of us are like, oh gosh, do we really want to have that many more of these little tiny hackers running around or not? So I thought, hey, let's give people options so that if you don't want one, you don't have to have one. I do not have any real or apparent conflicts of interest. I am not financially paid by any of the assorted companies that I'm going to mention. Happen to have one of their suitcases because they trained me, but that's about it. I will mention a few brand names just simply because they're the only type that's available in the US. Today, basically, what I want to do is do a general overview of the contraceptive options available in the US. I have it biased towards US because that's what I'm trained on. There are a few other options if you want to go to Canada or elsewhere. But for the most part, this is what I'm familiar with, so this is what I can talk to you about. So we're going to talk about what contraceptive options are available, what are their pros and cons, how effective they are, and as you see, I brought in at least some samples so you guys can check them out and get a sense of, okay, is this for me or is this for someone I care about or not? Before we start, I figured let's take a look at contraception throughout time. This is actually a poster from the Contraceptive Museum at the Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine, their medical library. And apparently, once upon a time, somebody thought that candy wrappers could maybe decrease their chances of reproducing if they put them on certain things. Also, lemons, juice glasses, cat bones tied to a string, crocodile dung, lots of stuff. Needless to say, probably not so effective, but when you didn't have any options, this is what people came up with. It's kind of crazy, isn't it? Today, obviously, we have a lot more options. There's non-hormonal stuff, condoms and so on. There's hormonal stuff. There's IUDs, which actually I kind of bridged the gap because there's one non-hormonal and now two hormonal IUDs. There's a lot of different options, and the reason is no one option works well for everybody. Some options work better for some people than others, but having a lot of flexibility and choice means hopefully there's something that'll work for most people who want them. Just as a baseline, if you're not using any contraception, but you don't want to get pregnant, AKA crossing your fingers, hoping, things like that. Hey, nice thing about that, you don't have to think at all. You just do whatever you want. The not so nice thing is it's about 11 to 15% effective, which means 89% of folks who are doing that will get pregnant within a year. Kind of maybe not what you want if you really don't want to get pregnant. But if you want to get pregnant, hey, that's not bad odds. Withdrawal. A lot of people knock withdrawal. They say, oh gosh, that's no good. That's no better than just not doing anything at all. Technically, actually, it's a little bit better. It's not perfect, obviously. But if you really want to not do any other form of contraception, withdrawal, it's far better than nothing. 78% typical use. If you're really, 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 really good at it, it's going to even be better than that. But like I said, with typical use, you're going from 11% to 78. That's a pretty big jump. Could you go to the last slide for a second? Yeah. So 11 to 15% will get pregnant, or 89% will get pregnant? 89% will get pregnant, and 11 to 15 will not. Basically, I'm trying to use efficacy rate consistently throughout all of these. So it's like, how good is this at keeping people baby-proof? I think I fixed all my typos on this. Does this stat make sense now? The way I wrote it? Okay. Oh, I miswrote it then. I did do a typo. Well, yeah, 11 to 15 will not get pregnant, so 18 will get pregnant. Yeah, I need to delete about 3 words there, and then we'll be all set. Okay? I clearly did not proofread enough, sorry. Condoms. Advantage of condoms, over the counter, cheap, easily accessible. Drawbacks to them. Typically, the easiest ones to get are latex. If you have a latex allergy, ow, that's not a place where you want to have irritated skin. Drawback, less spontaneous, because it's like, oh, heat of the moment, and oh, hang on a sec, we got to do things to make sure we're baby-proof. But pretty effective. I mean, 85% typical. If you're really studious about it, make sure it's like, okay, is it on correctly, la-di-da-di-da. You probably can get better than that, but 85% typical. For those folks who are allergic to latex, there are options. There's polyurethane, a lot more expensive than the latex, a little harder to find. I know Amazon carries them. I don't know if the average store does. You may have to look a little harder to find them. They're less stretchy. They are less, and so because they're less stretchy, may potentially be more prone to breakage, but theoretically just as effective. There are other options. There's lambskin. I don't know if Amazon even has those, but theoretically they're out there. Some people say, oh, hey, they feel better. So if there's somebody who's like, oh, I really don't like condoms because I don't like the way they feel, might be an option. Probably not so good for STDs because it's a natural product, but theoretically they exist. There's female condoms. Once again, another option for people to say, oh, I don't like how they feel. Nice thing for women. Condoms usually go on men. Women can use condoms too. They basically look like this thing over here, a couple of squishy soft plastic rings and a sheath of plastic. A little less effective than the regular, the more typical condoms, but once again, gives people a little more flexibility. You don't have to take time out, got to put on the condom, because theoretically you could even have it there already well before anything interesting's going on. Then there's other barriers. I think over on that table there, I have a diaphragm fitting kit. Diaphragms are basically little, typically rubber latex-based discs. The ones I have in the fitting kit have holes. The real ones don't. And they are sized to fit the person's vagina. And they work pretty well. They actually, for a long time, were a very popular form of contraception. The drawback is you got to use permicide. And some people don't like that because, once again, if you've got sensitive skin, you really don't want irritated sensitive skin in that area. So if your body doesn't like spermicide, may not be the best option. Diaphragms work similar to cervical caps, as well as some of these other products such as Leah's Shield. Nice thing about those, they are reusable. Had a patient came in because she had a diaphragm for 10 years. It's like, okay, I think I need a new one. This one's starting to get a little stiff and cracked. But 10 years, you can get a lot of birth control out of one little product that way. Needs to be refitted if body shape changes, for example, due to having babies or things like that. But once again, it's a nice barrier option. Spermicide. As I mentioned, spermicide is a required option for using some of these barriers like the cervical cap or diaphragm, but it can be used by itself or it can be used in conjunction with anything else. So if you want to, I often suggest spermicide as an option for having a secondary method. So if you want to tack on, oh, I like my birth control pills, but I want to have something tangible just to kind of improve my odds, that's a nice option. They come in an assortment of applications, as well as sponges, which are basically little spongy things that are soaked in spermicide to give you a little more distance that these little spermies have to swim through. Efficacy, once again, probably on par of like withdrawal, not quite as good as condoms, but used with condoms, your efficacy actually goes up pretty well. For those folks who are a little more studious than me, there are an assortment of natural family planning options, basal body temperature, ovulation or monitoring cervical mucus. Nice thing about those, there's no barriers, no gadgets, no things, and no hormones. So this is a good option for people who have the time and the schedule that this works for them and who really dislike for various reasons or are uncomfortable with other options. Takes a little bit more time to learn how to use and learn to use effectively. But when used effectively, it's pretty decent. Once again, like 86% effective with typical use. There are some stats that if you combine all of the various natural planning methods, you really can get up close to the 90-somethings, like 96, 98% effective rate. Symptothermal is basically combining the first two, basically monitoring basal body temperature and cervical mucus. So like I said, the more you can combine, theoretically, your rate may improve. It's hard to say for sure because these aren't studied as well as some of the other forms of contraception. For those of you who've just had a baby sometime within the past 6 months, lactational amenorrhea, aka breastfeeding 100%, is a reasonable form of contraception. Only good for 6 months. So and only good until you ovulate, which usually happens 2 weeks before you have your first period. So theoretically, there's a small bit of gamble towards the tail end of that. When it's used, it's pretty gosh darn good. And oh, I guess my slide doesn't scale very well. But it's basically 98% effective when used exclusively breastfeeding, which means breastfeeding theoretically roughly every 3 to 4 hours round the clock for up to 6 months. Don't know about you, but I kind of like my sleep. And so if the kid cooperates, you're going to start spreading things out a little bit at night. So then your efficacy rate goes down. If you want to be a little less studious with natural family planning, there is a calendar method, which works great for people who have very consistent regular cycles. So if you've got a cycle that's, about 28 days consistently, you can just say, okay, well, let's see. If I'm supposed to ovulate 14 days before my period starts, then I just need to avoid right around that time, give or take a week, and we should be all set. Easy to use, not very difficult to understand. Only works, like I said, if you've got consistent cycles. Standard days is kind of similar. Basically uses beads instead of a calendar and scribbling, but same sort of concept. I think they make it a little more variable in the number of beads, and that gives it a little bit of an edge over the calendar as far as efficacy goes. To round out the non-hormonal options, there's of course permanent stuff, and hey, here's where we get the guys back in here again. We can tie tubes. We can tie guys' tubes. We can tie girls' tubes. We can shove things inside of tubes and make them scar and close up. That's what Essure is. Nice thing about these methods, they are permanent. You get one of these and theoretically you are done forever and ever and ever. Bad thing is, you're done forever and ever and ever. So if you want to change your mind, theoretically you might be able to, but certainly no guarantees. And insurance may or may not pay to undo any of these options. But they're pretty gosh darn good. I mean, we're talking 99%, 99+% effective with typical use. So you want to be really, really sure? You can be really, really sure and not have to do any hormones or any other stuff. Moving on to the hormones. This is a whole big family. Once upon a time, it was just the pill. Now it's the pill, the patch, the ring, the injections, implants. There's also emergency contraception. Advantage, you don't have any of the drawbacks of the physical barriers. You don't have any of the issues as far as things that you have to use or calendars or being studious and keeping track of stuff, other than, hey, did I remember to put my ring in? Did I remember to take my pill? Things like that. Disadvantage, all the side effects of hormones. Some people like the side effects, some people don't like the side effects, and it kind of depends on how it interacts with the person taking these hormonal contraceptives. For example, irregular periods are sometimes an option for some of the longer-acting hormones. May have an effect on folks who have migraines, may have an effect on folks as far as libido issues. And it is actually contraindicated for some folks. For example, if you have a history of clotting issues, then estrogen is usually a bad idea. If you have a history of, say, breast cancer, usually you want to stay away from the hormones. But for the most part, these are pretty good options for the large majority of women out there. Sorry, guys, there's no hormonal methods for guys available in the US yet. We're trying, but not there yet. That being said, there's birth control pills, there's combined pills, there's progestin-only pills. The difference, estrogen, I think, makes it a little bit easier to have a little flexibility with your pills. If you're on progestin only, you run the risk of spotting more often because If you don't take it exactly at the exact same time, say 12:30 every day, day in, day out, you might spot a little bit more. But they are equally effective otherwise. Some people like the side effects of the pill, like I said, improved acne or things like that. It's a soft contraindication with the note about smokers, because tobacco or smokers, tobacco users are at higher risk of clots, and estrogen, like I said, puts you at higher risk of clots. So that's why there's a note there. But theoretically, like I said, it's a soft contraindication as opposed to a hard one. The patch in the ring. For those of you, like me, who have trouble remembering to take pills every day, gosh, that's really hard. I have trouble remembering to take my allergy pills every day. I really don't want to worry about anything else. There are options like the patch. You stick a patch on, you're good for a week. You take it off, put a new one on. Or the Nuva ring, which is, like I said, a squishy globe bracelet type thingy, which I think is floating around maybe back there. Yep, there's a Nuva ring. Cool thing about NuvaRing, it's in once a month, and you get a little bit of flexibility because it's technically good for 35 days. So you could say, oh, on the 1st of every month, I will put a new one in. Or you could say, well, every 4 weeks, I'll put a new one in, 3 weeks later, take it out, and so on. A week later, put a new one in. And then you got basically the same pattern that you typically get with most birth control pills. Very effective, 91% of efficacy rate if you're perfectly using them, a little longer. Drawback, orthoevra, weight limit, which is kind of weird. I think the weight limit is actually based on what they have studied and tested, and they found that for folks who weigh more than a certain amount, they don't absorb quite as much of the hormone, and it becomes a little less effective. Why 198 pounds? I assume they based it on kilos, which I think is 80 kilos, 85, I'm not sure off the top of my head. But I think that's why they came up with that really funny number. So yeah, that one matters. The other drawback to orthoevra is it's a little heavier on the estrogen than the other forms of contraception out there. So for folks who need to be cautious about estrogen, I tend to steer them away from that option. There is, for the people who are even more forgetful than, hey, I can do something once a week or once a month, you can do something once every 3 months or every 12 weeks. Depo-Provera, it's been around for forever. It's a great shot. It's very popular, heavily recommended for teenagers. Because, gosh, we assume that teenagers don't remember things very well. See, I figure, no, like I said, I'm the one who doesn't remember things well, but this is a really nice option for people who, life's helter-skelter, who don't want to have any sort of physical gadgets or barriers or things like that, but want to have a reliable form of contraception. Nice thing about Depo, most people have no periods. Gosh, that's really, really handy for a lot of people. Freaks a few people out, but you know, most of the people like that side effect. Drawback, it's a lot of hormone running around in your bloodstream. It's not locked up in any sort of gadget. It is, you have 3 months worth of stuff running through there and causing various effects. So when you're on Depo-Provera, bones might be a little less strong. You stop that. Usually your bone density comes right back again, but it's worth noting that that's one of the side effects. As far as, if you really don't want all that stuff running around your bloodstream, then I usually recommend going to something called Implanon or Nexplanon. Technically, they are the same thing. They are from the same company, Merck. The only difference is Nexplanon, you can do an x-ray and say, oh, hey, there's a rod in there. Implanon, not so much. Basically, it's a rod that goes under the skin, right about there. And I believe there is a little squishy sample right there, and you can kind of feel what it feels like. It's a subdermal implant, not visible. Even if you're anorexic, it should not be visible, but it is palpable when it is implanted. Nice thing about that, it lasts 3 years. So for the really forgetful people, hey, this is good for 3 years, which is really nice and handy. Compared to Depo-Provera, you don't necessarily have that, most likely you won't have periods side effect, but a lot of people have either no periods or have lighter versions of their regular periods. Some people will have irregular bleeding or spotting. For the most part, it's lighter than what they normally have, but like I said, it's not quite as much of a guarantee of no periods. The other drawback, it's not going into a physical, actual space. It is just going underneath the skin. Historically, there have been similar contraceptive rods. Norplant is one of them that used to have 5 rods. You have to go in and find 5 rods 5 years later. lots of mushing around. Sometimes they shift, sometimes they migrate. Theoretically, you can find all 5. This is only 1, so it shouldn't be so bad. But still, like I said, not in a physical space. So there's a risk that it may shift a little and there may be some issues with getting it out. Yes?
Are they still breakable? I say still because I had a friend of mine.
If it breaks, it does not affect its efficacy. So if it breaks, it's not going to release all the hormone. It's actually embedded in the plastic that is used to make the rod. So you won't suddenly get a massive overdose if it breaks. So theoretically, it is breakable, but it is, other than you got to make sure you get both pieces, that's not going to be a problem. Okay? And even if it does break, theoretically, they stay roughly in the same spot. It just makes removal, like I said, a little more complicated if you have more pieces to go fishing for. But 99.95% effective. If you remember back to tubal ligation, vasectomy, things like that, that's the same. So if you want something that's as good as permanent, but you might change your mind down the road, implant or Nexplanon is a nice option. Which brings us to the other forms of contraception that are really ridiculously good. IUDs. These go into a physical space. They go inside of a uterus. They are little, in the US, they're little T-shaped things. There's Paragard, which is the copper IUD, which is seen right here. And then there's Mirena. And actually, in addition to Mirena, there's now Skyla, which just came out within the past year. And it has a little bit of hormone. It has only progesterone. From Depo to Implanon, Nexplanon to the Levono, Jithdrawal IUDs, they're all just progesterone. There's no estrogen, so you don't have to worry about any of the risks of side effects associated with estrogen. Once again, like I said, ridiculously good. We're talking 99+% effective, so about as good as if you got your tubes tied. But pop it out, you could be fertile next cycle. Hey, cool. For people who are wondering, okay, well, why would you get one versus the other? If you've got really light periods, not much cramping, your periods aren't too bad, and hormones really disagree with you, go with the copper. If you've got heavy periods, lots of cramping, you really don't want all that stuff, you want the hormonal side effects that usually come with progesterone. You want to go with a Levono Jithdrawal IUD. Like I said, there's a new one, Skyla, that just came out. It is good for 3 years. The company that makes both of these IUDs is marketing Skyla to teenagers. For a long time, IUDs were discouraged for people who have never had children. That has changed. Supposedly, Skyla is better for teens or better for people who haven't had children. In reality, I'm not convinced. But that's what the marketing supposedly says. It's good for 3 years instead of Mirena, which is officially good for 5, unofficially good as far as contraceptive purposes goes for 7 years. So these are actually very cost effective. As one of our attendees pointed out to me, thanks to the Affordable Care Act, most of these forms of contraception are free. But nice thing about this is if you're willing to spend the money up front, even if you don't have insurance, if you're willing to spend the money up, these are really cost effective over time because you're talking $600 for 5 to 7 years, as opposed to paying $30 a pop for pills. So relatively effective and relatively affordable. For those who are like, oh, crud, I forgot to use anything. There's emergency contraception. There's Plan B. Plan B is now available over the counter. I think you still have to ask the pharmacist for it, so it's one of those behind-the-counter, over-the-counter things, but you don't need a prescription. You don't even have to be 18 anymore. You can be 17 or 16. I think as of about less than a month ago, that has changed. So you can get Plan B. Plan B is a progesterone-only pill, or 2 pills. It's good for up to 120 hours after intercourse, decreases your chances of getting pregnant, basically by making it a little harder for sperm to get to egg or for egg to get to implant and things like that. It is not 100% known, which is why some people are uneasy with it, but it is excellent as far as risk reduction goes. This is a different stat compared to the others because this is what are your chances of getting pregnant before you're taking it versus after, as opposed to the 1 year of continuous use, because my hope is most people don't use this for a year continuously, because holy cow, that's a lot of hormones. You can do this with other options, though, other than Plan B. If you got regular old-fashioned birth control pills, you can look up online, how many pills do I need to take of this pill or that pill? Doesn't work with all birth control pills. but it works with a significant number of them, depending on what the mix of estrogen and progesterone is. If you're going to use regular birth control pills, not quite as effective, because it's got the estrogen in there. Also, more likely to cause some nausea, vomiting, queasiness, things like that. So more side effects, short term. Otherwise, actually really safe, which is why Plan B is available over the counter, and even using the regular birth control pills is informal instructions, and those instructions are available online. If you say, oh my gosh, I forgot to use any birth control and I want something that's really reliable for 10 years, you can put in a Paragard for up to 120 hours after intercourse. Works really well. If for some reason, somehow you manage to get pregnant anyways, you can actually usually get the IUD out if you want to keep the pregnancy, or you can do something to get rid of the pregnancy and keep the IUD in. Worth negotiating with your care provider about those sorts of options. But like I said, Paragard, totally awesome form of emergency contraception if you want some long-term contraception rolled in. As I mentioned, there are tons of resources online. Most of my stats I pulled from Trucell's contraceptive failure in the United States. The numbers actually shift, it seems, so I updated them from my last batch from 2007 to the 2011 listings. If you want to look up emergency contraception pill conversion, you would go to EC or emergencycontraception.princeton.edu, and they will list what pills can be used for emergency contraception. If you want to find fact sheets with detailed information about all your contraceptive options, Reproductive Health Access Project is a relatively new resource within the past year or two. Excellent, excellent teaching materials. So as much as you want to know about any sort of contraception, it is there. Now we get to play. So, like I said, I have a whole bunch of different options. I don't have everything. I didn't bring condoms because I think most people know what condoms are like. But I did bring some IUDs. I brought I brought a Nuva ring and, like I said, the demo Implanon, which is the same as Nexplanon, which you can kind of feel. And I have a lot more knowledge in my head, so if there's anyone who has any specific questions, feel free to ask. Okay? Anybody? Yeah?
Maybe I missed everything you said, but with regard
Do we need to bring a mic? I just realized. If you don't want it recorded, then I guess we don't have to give you a mic, but...
when you were talking about the Skyla versus the Mirena,
yes.
Did you say you weren't convinced that the Skyla is any better than the Mirena in terms of women that haven't had children, or did you say that...
I'm not convinced.
Or you're not
convinced?
In
my opinion, a Mirena can be put in somebody who's never had kids. Mm-hmm. And the size of the inserting device is actually like a fraction of a millimeter smaller. So in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it's a significant difference. That being said, I have not actually played with a Skyla yet, because it's, like I said, really new. But that's what needs to fit through a cervix on a Mirena. Skyla, like I said, fraction of a millimeter smaller.
So you're just
so
not
pretty
convinced,
small.
You're not convinced that the Skyla is any better than the Mirena? You didn't say...
Not really. I don't trust the company very much. And like I said, that's probably because I'm not paid by them.
It's the newer product, probably.
I'm wondering if this might be coming out of patent at some point in the near future, and they're doing...
Okay.
Yeah. Or trying to get a new audience. Because typically the old-fashioned recommendation was that folks who haven't had kids can't get IUDs. And there are people out there, even though, yes, they can, not all the providers know that. So, any other questions? Oh, I guess we should give you a mic, huh?
Do you know what the current accepted failure rate for abstinence is?
Nobody has statistics on willpower, unfortunately. Really, I think it's variable, and most people can guess for themselves how good their willpower is. But in my opinion, yeah, it fails just as well as anything else does. Any other questions?
Please repeat the question. How quickly do the implants start working?
They are a slow release. I believe they start working within 7 days. I can give you a definitive answer in, a sec. Like I said, reproductive. I think it's going to actually be covered in the how to switch. And I think implants, 7 days. So, for example, if you're transitioning from various contraceptions to various contraceptions, that's what this massive table is for. For the most part, most of the hormonal contraception is effective within 7 days. If it is started on day 1 of period, or I think within the first 5 days of one's period, it is effective immediately. But for the most part, 7 days is reasonable. Yeah, as medical providers, sometimes we say, you know, I would say wait for a month, especially, for example, pill users, for people who aren't sure if they're going to take it consistently yet. I try to say give them a month of practice. But theoretically, assuming you're doing everything right, usually a week's good enough. Yeah.
I know we've had this discussion previously, but I'm wondering if your opinion has changed. What is your feeling on the provider pushing the patient towards one option or another, regardless of that's what their preferred vendor is, or like, what is your view on what the patient wants versus what the provider may think is best for them?
In the grand scheme of things, it's your body. You can do whatever the heck you want with it. That being said, for a while, I could not put in implants or Nexplants because I was not trained by the company, and they require, you couldn't just get trained by, say, my residency, who trained me on all the other forms of contraceptive devices. It had to be trained by one of the company representatives. So I couldn't place that. So access might have been a barrier that some providers would quote, because it's like, gosh, you know, I kind of would like to keep that in-house. Doesn't matter to me because my pay goes to my employers, and then I get paid from them, as opposed to I get paid directly for each thing I do. So you'll get a little bit of variance there, probably, by what they're allowed to do officially. As far as saying, okay, well, I think this might be better for you or worse for you, they may have recommendations specifically with hormones or specifically with estrogen based off of your medical history. For example, folks with migraines with aura or classic migraines, it might be better off avoiding estrogen or things like that. Or folks who are smokers might be better off avoiding certain things.
So what about like a provider refusing to take on a patient who may have like a clotting condition? I ask because I've had several providers that when I was one of the 1 in like 1 million that has a stroke from taking the pill. And when trying to find a new provider to go and have my IUD placed, I had a lot of providers, as soon as they looked at my medical history and said, oh, you have these 2 gene mutations, I'm sorry, we don't want you.
You know, somebody's got to take care of you.
that was my root behind the question is,
yes.
How do you feel about having a patient come in and say, I've had like 6 providers deny me to come in and make an appointment?
Personally, I don't think it's right for someone to say, you are too sick for me to take care of. That being said, I can kind of understand it, because there's certain things, it's like, okay, you're out of the scope of my practice. But if they say that, they should say, you are too interesting. You need to go see this specialist who is really good, instead of saying, oh, I can't help you, go open the phone book and find somebody else. Because that is not good care.
That's basically what they did to me. Is I got a lovely letter back after I called to make an appointment that said, based on my medical history, they didn't feel that I was a patient they would be interested in treating, which was basically BS for we don't want the liability of your fragile little self.
Which is great, because, oh my gosh, what happens if you get pregnant? Because, holy cow, that increases your risk of clotting too.
Yeah, I was highly warned against that.
Since we're talking about medical, hard and soft contraindications, like I said, reproductive access has within it a very, very thorough chart listing medical contraindications for contraception, specifically hormonal contraception, which you can feel free to peruse. I have a feeling it's not going to show up really nicely on this because it's so tiny. Okay, or my computer's just not going to let me open it. Oh, the problem is it's thinking. Fine. But I would probably turn to that and say, okay, well, let's see, based off of your history, is this a hard contraindication versus a soft contraindication? Yeah, probably the safest thing for someone who has had a stroke in the past, the safest thing would probably be to stay away from hormones altogether. That being said, is that the practical option? Not necessarily, because if you bleed like a stuck pig every month, you really, really, really don't want a Paragard, because then you'll bleed more, about 25% more. And that's just not very fun. So it's a matter of weighing risks and benefits. And that's a discussion that you should have with your provider, if they will take you.
My provider gave me the excuse that because the Mirena is so localized hormones that it wouldn't upset anything else.
It shouldn't.
But to walk into a provider and say, okay, I have a prothrombin gene mutation and I have MTHFR, they look at me and go, and you're breathing?
Well, apparently. Okay, now what?
Yeah, unfortunately, sometimes my blood is the consistency of pancake syrup.
Yeah.
I can't help it.
So, okay, any other questions?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
I actually tried to donate blood and it clotted before it made it into the bag. They looked at me and they're like, you need to go home now.
Yeah, oops. Maybe next time make sure you have a little extra, or go light on the spinach for a while ahead of time. Maybe cut down on your vitamin K, and maybe that'll help.
Or the gene mutation that will protect the human race from vampires.
Nice!
I have a gene mutation that makes surgeons run screaming.
Let's see. Yeah. Yeah, at least according to this sheet, you would land under number 2 for most things except for estrogen, because I'm assuming you would count as a history or various clotty something, so that lands in the 2, which is, advantages generally outweigh the theoretical or proven risks, which is really, I'd get antsy around the 3s, but 2 is like, oh yeah, do it. So, okay. If folks have other questions, I will be running around the con all weekend. Look for the ears, and I'm happy to chat one-on-one. Unofficially, I'm not your doctor, so you have to take that with a grain of salt, okay? Thank you, guys.